All right, how's it going, everybody? Today we're going to be looking at evolution. First we should define it. So evolution is a change in species over time. And when we're talking about a species, I'm referring to an organism that can only reproduce with another organism just like it and it has to be able to produce fertile offspring. So we wouldn't be anywhere in evolution without Charles Darwin. He traveled around the world studying life, and he ended up in the Galapagos Islands. Um, During his travels, that whole part of sailing around, he saw a bunch of different evidence for evolution, and it all came together in his study of the Galapagos Islands. He noticed variation between bird species on the island, particularly in their beak. So it became the first physical evidence of difference within species. Um, he developed the idea of natural selection to explain these differences. And his hypothesis would have been that species change over many generations and become better adapted to their environment. And so that idea that it happens over many generations is key. So natural selection is that organisms with the best traits to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. We also call this the survival of the fittest. So there's three principles. One is overproduction. So that's when an organism produces more offspring than can survive. I didn't have a nice little picture for this one, but you could think back to when we talked about turtles hatching and then producing more baby turtles than could survive. Second idea is variation. So in members of a species, they're going to differ from one another in many of their traits. So if you look at variation on the right, here's my picture of finches, and you can see each one of these. Each finch has a different beak shape, so it's got variation within the species. And then the last thing is that there's going to be competition for food, space, and other resources within that species. So they're going to be fighting for food, fighting for space, and the species that does that most effectively is going to survive and be able to pass on its genes to its offspring. So let's look at those two words, variation and adaptation. Variation would just be the differences that you see amongst individuals of the same species. And then we call an adaptation the variation that makes an organism better suited to its environment. So it's going to have a better chance of surviving, whether that means that it's going to blend in better or it's going to find food better. Any variation that makes it better suited to its environment. Okay, so now we're going to look at the evidence for evolution. And we looked at whale and human evolution in class. Um, and we talked about four ways that scientists can find evidence for evolution. So the first of those is homologous structures. And if you look in the picture on the right, you can see they've even colored in the bones so that you see from a penguin to a bat. You've got all these similar bone structures in the arm and in the hand. Um, so um, it's each time the arm hasn't been reinvented for the organism. It is a very similar in structure and possibly has a different function, but the overall bone structure is very similar between different organisms. Another piece of evidence for evolution that scientists use are fossil remains. So we have no way of going back in time and looking at organisms thousands of years ago or millions of years ago, but we do find fossil evidence. And so when we get enough of that evidence, we can put together a story of how that organism changed over time. And on the page on the right, what I did is I showed you, or I'm showing you some of the fossil evidence for whale evolution. So these were all different species found over millions of years ago that link this extinct whale cousin from 48 million years ago to modern whale. and you can see the changes in their spine and in their appendages over time. Another evidence for evolution that we can now use is DNA evidence. We can look at DNA between different organisms. And if you looked at, so this is looking at one protein that's shared in all these organisms here on the right-hand side. And the chimpanzee only has one amino acid different, or the chimpanzee doesn't have any amino acids different from human. A rhesus monkey only has one. A rabbit has 9 amino acids. And a yeast, which is totally looks nothing like a human being, has 42 amino acids different, which isn't that many. So the molecule of DNA or the molecules of the amino acids and proteins are very similar between organisms that look very different. Another evidence for evolution would be embryo development. Embryos, if you can go into the womb and look at the developing embryos here, you've got a human embryo developing, a rabbit, a chicken, a turtle, a salamander, and a fish. So you can see in the first few weeks of development, they look pretty similar. Causes for evolution would be mutations, breeding, sudden disturbances can also cause evolution, so large change in the environment. As in dog breeding, you can cause changes in organisms. You can also, in plants, you see that a lot, different breeding between plants changing, causing changes in the organism, as well as mutation. So there's got to be a change in the DNA that will change the overall organism. So the word for how new species form. So if you wondered, how do we go from one species to another species or the formation of a completely new one, it's called speciation. And these new species can form when they've been cut off or isolated long enough to evolve different traits and to prevent reproduction. So in the picture that we've got here is if we took our beetle population and you divided it, and those two beetle populations stayed divided over a long period of time, so that even if, hundreds or thousands of years down the line, if you were to put those beetles in proximity, they wouldn't be able to mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. And initially when Darwin was talking about evolution, he was talking about evolution in a gradual sense. So small changes adding up to a major change over a long period of time. So if we look at our bird picture on the right here, you've got this orange colored bird or peach colored, and it slowly changes in one sense to the red, or in the other into the yellow bird. So those two bird species maybe are separated. There's something in the environment that's leading the yellow bird to survive better here, or a yellow coloration to survive better on this side, and something leading to in the environment for the red bird to survive better on this side. And over time, if you were to take a snapshot at any one time, you would see some small step in the development of the birds. So that's one way, and that's called gradualism. The other way is called punctuated equilibrium, and it's when species evolve during short periods of rapid change and then don't change very much. So what could happen is possibly some big environmental change happened here that caused a splitting or a fragmentation of our two species, and they changed rapidly. So we've got a yellow and a red emerging quickly, and then they're relatively stable after that. So the yellow bird continues to survive and the red bird continues to survive.